The History of Criminal Justice and Mental Health. Hello, my name's Hayden Smith, and this is the first chapter of my book, Criminal Justice and Mental Health by Hayden Smith, 2022. And in this chapter, I explore how we've come to this current state of deinstitutionalization in America. What are the roots of criminal justice and mental health? I begin by pointing out that we often have stereotypes of inmates or offenders with mental health. Currently, the three biggest mental health facilities in America are jails and prisons. And there are more people with mental illness who are incarcerated than there are people who are not incarcerated. So our criminal justice system has become a default mental health system. A lot of people have stereotypical views of this. If we look at this image in the top right, a very common visual are men in orange jumpsuits, handcuffs, shackles, an officer walking by, institutionalized in a jail or a prison. This does not reflect the diversity of the criminal justice system, but it is the stereotype that a lot of people have in their mind. So how did we get here? How did this start? Well, the origins of mental illness as it occurs in the criminal justice system is based entirely in religious approaches. Prior to 1800, there was a very strong reliance on religion. Both criminality and mental illness were seen as a direct conflict with the values that underline democracy and capitalism. These values include things such as seeking material wealth, freedom, equality of opportunity, independence, and productivity. As one can imagine, if a person engages in criminal behavior, if a person has a severe or profound mental illness, it can impact their opportunity. They may become more dependent as they have mental health needs, and it may reduce their access to material wealth. It may also threaten the number one American characteristic of high productivity. So these values are threatening to society, and when they merge together, they're doubly threatening. So a religious approach was often seen in terms like a demonic possession or lunacy, which was describing mental illness. We also see this in criminal justice. The word penitentiary is based in the word penance, which means an offender would go to prison or jail. They would be housed in isolation, in silence, and the goal was to make them sit there and reflect on their crimes, to think about what they did, and in some way to do penance and then to emerge as a different person. Of course, this didn't work because there are a number of social and economic factors that push people into crime and also impact mental health. However, there was an entire reliance on religious approaches to addressing both crime and mental illness. This was often reinforced by a criminal justice system that relied on physical punishment. This can include whippings, brandings, mutilations, public shaming in the stock and pillory, and leading up until the common practice of the death penalty. Jails would be used often as drunk tanks, would swell up, people would go to court, and then they would entirely empty out until they were filled up again. This is foreign to a lot of people who understand the modern day criminal justice system. Currently, if somebody enters a jail or a prison, they'll be classified by risks and needs. This didn't happen prior to 1800 in any manner. In fact, offenders, and particularly those with mental illnesses, were placed in any setting that was convenient and cheap. Trains, abandoned building, old mines and caves, pretty much any setting was used to house men, women, and children together, as well as violent and non-violent inmates. As one can imagine, if there was no categorization, violence increased, mental illness increased, and so did the outbreak of physical diseases. We don't know a tremendous amount from this early period. A lot of the population did not write or was illiterate. There's not a lot of recorded history from the perspective of offenders with mental illness in the system. And so we don't know a tremendous amount. However, we do know that there was a strong leaning towards religious solutions and the use of physical punishments that were often very harsh. Around 1800, this began to change. These early approaches were challenged by Quakers who suggested a more humanizing approach to crime and mental illness. Now, Quakers still relied on the solution of moral therapy, that is, reinforcing American and/or Christian values to address crime and to address mental illness. However, there was also the inclusion of making people who had a mental illness or a disability more humanizing approaches and approaches that provided them with some sense of dignity. This was reinforced by people from other countries, such as Alexis de Tocqueville, who toured America and studied the American prison system. He wrote a famous book called Democracy in America, published in 1835. And he also wrote a book with de Beaumont in 1833, specifically called On the Penitentiary System in the United States and its Application in France. And now de Tocqueville documented, he was one of the first to document some of these effects in the prison. He found inmates, for example, housed with pigs, in dungeons, all sorts of horrendous, brutal, harsh ways of housing inmates, particularly those with mental illness. He published this work, and so the general public got to know that the conditions in which inmates and those suffering from mental illness were housed. And this started to open up some sort of awareness of what was going on. Now, once again, there was still a reliance on moral hygiene, on religious solutions. Two things changed this system, and two individuals specifically. And this occurred once again, in the period of 1800 to about 1890. The first was Dr. Benjamin Rush, who is considered the father of American psychiatry. And Benjamin Rush was one of the first to really conceptualize mental illness as a disease of the mind, not some sort of indication of immorality or ethics. So he engaged in body dissections of criminals, people who had died by suicide, and suggested that there may be physical, biological roots rather than some sort of moral choice in all of the approaches. Now, Rush did not favor the religious approach. He developed some early medicine. Now, some of these medical approaches now we know are harmful. Vomiting, blistering of the skin, drinking toxic substances. Rush even developed something called a tranquilizing chair, in which a person was strapped down into to control the flow of blood to the brain. These were all thought to be solutions. So while the solutions now maybe seem as harmful or somewhat ridiculous, Rush did open up the idea that mental health could be treated in other ways beyond a moral or religious approach. He even said a hospital instead of a jail, and to the hands of a physician instead of the hands of the last officer, is the place or the approach that should be used for these inmates and offenders who have a mental illness. Now, this early medical approach was reinforced with one of social work and advocacy by Dorothea Dix. Dorothea Dix taught Sunday school class to inmates in a correctional facility, and she noticed that there were several people with mental illness who were in rooms without heat. She asked the warden to help by building a fire. When that was refused, she then went on a pathway towards politics, advocacy, dealing with state legislator, really changing the way this treatment occurs. She introduced bills to develop the first mental health hospital, and this was reinforced by soldiers returning from the Civil War at the time who were displaying signs that they didn't know at the time, but we would now definitely say signs of post-traumatic stress, signs of battle fatigue, and mental health issues as a result of being involved in warfare. So there are a number of social factors that led to Dix really advocating for the use of mental health hospitals. Now, some of these other social factors that were quite massive. One of the things that happened during this time in America was mass immigration from countries overseas and large population changes in urban areas. As industrialization developed in urban areas, Americans in rural areas relocated. There was a mass population change, for example, in African Americans in rural areas from the South moving to hubs to work in factories in St. Louis, Chicago, and some of these types of cities. So there was a large social change. This led to a lot of homeless people being on the street, a more evident observation of people with mental illness being on the street in urban areas and cities, and also people with disabilities emerging, particularly those from the Civil War who had physical disabilities as a result of the war. There still was a presence of moral treatment even with Dix. That is, there's still a approach by Dorothea Dix to for these offenders to stay away from alcohol, focus on things like poetry, engaging in hard labor, and using correctional officers as moral guides. But you see the religious ideals as an approach to solving these two problems of crime and mental illness kind of going down and going away. And what emerges during this period is what they call the Build to Cure program. This is really an idea that's rooted in Dix and other people's approaches, which is this idea that the architecture, the building structure, could actually help in terms of therapy and changing a person's criminality and mental health. So offenders who had a mental illness who went through the criminal justice system were often placed in these mental health hospitals. They're also called at this time asylums, and you can specifically look for the word Kirkbride hospitals, and some of them are still in existence today. These were Victorian era structures, very large, beautiful buildings, beautiful grounds that were kept well with farms and gardens. The idea was to move these offenders with mental illness to these settings, and these settings would become more conducive to treatment. Of course, they didn't always work because there was a wide disagreement on diagnosis of mental illness. There was not much understood in terms of medications or other treatment approaches. But this was the approach for about 100 years. What emerged next is what's called the medical model. This occurs from about 1890 to 1950. So as the moral treatment approaches moves away, there's a movement towards scientific developments in medicine, the medical model. And the approach here is that crime and mental illness does not occur through choice or morals, but is actually the result of the sick mind. The person in some way is sick, therefore they're committing crime or they're mentally ill. This approach still somewhat exists today. Once again, the solutions we look back at, and they were quite varied and in some cases harmful. So early efforts included lobotomies on patients. A doctor would go in, often without anesthesia, and drill a hole into the offender's head. There was other things such as giving offenders insulin and even electroconvulsive therapy, where they received shocks to stimulate brain waves. In one case, the electroconvulsive therapy, Dr. Freeman and other doctors, these were famous doctors at the time, would even use metal picks into the eye socket of the patient and touch their frontal lobe of their brains in order to stimulate change and to have a different outcome for those individuals. Of course, we look back and these approaches were unethical, but this medical experimentation has continued to this day. Inmates who are incarcerated are a vulnerable population, and so we have historical examples where doctors using the medical model went in and conducted a range of unethical tests to see what happened. During this time, we also have a eugenics movement in America, where people with mental illness were susceptible to things like forced birth control, where they would be forced to have an abortion, castration, sterilization, so they could not reproduce. This was challenged by an 18-year-old woman named Carrie Buck, who was raped and became pregnant. Under Virginia law at the time, she was forced to be sterilized. That is, she could not have any other children after the procedure. And she and her lawyers challenged the case. Justice Holmes on the Supreme Court famously said, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. Meaning we can't have, in his view, populations that are criminal, mentally ill, or disabled. They are unfit using a eugenics approach. These laws were very harmful for people with mental illness. True numbers are not known, but there's estimates that about 30,000 people were sterilized in jails, prisons, or other institutions just in the late 1930s alone. These efforts were eventually challenged, and following the eugenics movement of Nazi Germany, they were outright dismissed. One interesting thing about Germany at this time is post-traumatic stress disorder also occurred leading up to this time period. And so that we see the emergence of soldiers returning from different wars and the effect of war on their psychological well-being. These early times we heard things like shell shock or combat stress, which is now known as PTSD. So these developments culminated to our third period, which is about 1950, 1965, even up to the 70s. And we know in America there was massive social changes, often stimulated by the baby boomers, which were a large group of babies produced after their fathers and emerged back from the war, and they had lots of babies. So it was a baby boomer group that had a very large number of people. And the baby boomer group challenged society during this time period of the 60s. They challenged everything. They challenged socioeconomic class, they challenged disability, they challenged crime, mental health. During this time period, things that were assumed to be basic concepts were reconsidered. During this time, we also see the emergence of psychotropic medication, particularly the use of thorazine, which remains the benchmark drug for schizophrenia today. We see the emergence of medications, pills, tablets, and some early drugs that we seem to have some sort of effect on people with mental illness, often a positive effect. It could stabilize mood, for example. It could lead to a reduction of symptoms such as seeing things or hearing things in the case of schizophrenia. And during this time, even up until 1966, drugs that were illegal, such as LSD, which was legal until 1966, and Also, other drugs that have remained illegal, like heroin and marijuana, which is kind of in the middle right now. But back then, some of these illegal drugs were also viewed as a way that people with mental illness could cope or to deal with life. While there's still a religious and moralistic approach to drug use, we do know that people with mental illness often gravitate towards taking drugs, both legal and illegal. Illegal drugs as a way to self-medicate and as a way to cope with the symptoms of mental illness. The number one drug that is used, of course, is alcohol. A great number of people with mental health conditions will use alcohol as a way to cope with their symptoms. So this is an interesting period because we see the emergence of medication to treat mental illness. So we're moving away from a battle of physical punishments, a battle of the body, but towards a battle of the mind. During this time, because society is being questioned, we also come up with the anti-psychiatry movement. During this time, the concepts within psychiatry, psychology were questioned. For example, some of the early concepts of mental illness, like drapetomania, was a mental health condition that was identified as slaves running away from their slave owners. Total nonsense, of course, and some of these psychiatrists and psychologists, such as Thomas Sachs in the 60s and 70s, said, well, if you have these nonsense diagnoses before in history, maybe we have some now. We also see challenges once again to the church. For example, insanity as a concept was often a legal maneuver that the church used. The argument was if a person committed suicide, they must be insane, and the family could therefore keep their property. If the person was not insane, the church would often take their property. So we see this impact between social forces, economic forces, and religious forces still going through this period. Other questions that emerge, such as the famous sociologist Goffman, who called asylums and prisons total institutions. Goffman said that asylums and prisons were very similar. They were governed by very strict routines. They were governed by uniforms. They were identified as a place where a person lacks freedom. And so there was a movement, particularly in sociology, to look at the social setting where offenders and people with mental illness were housed and how they were treated in the criminal justice system. This continued through to the late 60s, but you also see the emergence at this time of a bureaucracy. The criminal justice system in this time was built up very heavily. By the 80s, there was a movement towards mass incarceration, 3 strikes are out, and other harsh punishments. And so police, courts, and correctional systems really exploded, and they grew dramatically from the 50s till about the 80s. As part of this, we do see the emergence of certain legal rules, ethical rules that were designed to promote the rights of people who were incarcerated in prison and jail, as well as those who were institutionalized in asylums, mental health hospitals. This all leads us to where we are today, deinstitutionalization. Deinstitutionalization is one of the most key components of this topic. It is fundamental. Deinstitutionalization is a good idea that went bad. The idea was that counties, local government, and state government could use the development of Medicaid and Medicare And they could move a group of people out of mental institutions such as asylums and also out of prisons and jails where they may not be receiving the care, and they move them into community settings, general hospitals, clinics, halfway houses. In other words, it's a community-based approach to dealing with these problems of crime and mental health. In some ways, this was a battle of the budgets. The costs of dealing with crime and mental illness were moved from the federal government to the state government. And during this time, thousands and thousands of inmates were released. They overwhelmed the mental health services in the community. What happened was some people with mental health issues were fortunate enough to have families or some sort of social support or enough money to support themselves and to maintain their mental health. However, a large number were not. This created cycles of homelessness, poverty, drug use, and drug addiction that created expensive cycles back into prisons and jails for this group. The numbers here tell the full picture. In 1934, the ratio of prison inmates to mental health hospital patients was 1 to 4. So for every one inmate in prison, there were 4 patients in a mental health hospital. That's 1934, 1 to 4. By 2010, this number had flipped to a 3 to 1. That means that in 2010, for every 3 prison inmates, there was one person in a mental health hospital. In other words, this population massively moved to where by 2013, we only had about 5% of this population in a mental health hospital or asylum. 95% were incarcerated. This also led to the emergence of more people with what we call serious and persistent mental health issues. This means mental health issues that are very difficult to treat, and they can lead to outbreaks of violence, suicide, victimization, and other problems, including recidivism for crime. Deinstitutionalization is now viewed as a well-intentioned policy that led to a lot of problems and failures. We now have a return to warehousing. This is the idea that prisons served as a dumping ground for people who were undesirable, like people with a mental illness. It was a way to isolate people from society. In recent years, this has changed. Between 1993 to now, we've seen a complete reduction in the overall crime rate. There's a number of factors, but one of the driving factors is that baby boomer generation have now aged out of crime. This generation are in their late 60s, 70s, and 80s, which decreases risk of crime. This baby boomer generation also has often aged out of very severe or persistent mental health issues that can lead to early death and or overcoming these issues. So crime and mental illness is reduced in this group, so it's actually reduced all over society. We've had 30 years of depreciating crime, and our jails and prisons are essentially being emptied out. However, deinstitutionalization remains. The effects are still here today. We have high flyers who are offenders with a serious persistent mental illness who cycle through the criminal justice system repeatedly, and they never have their mental health needs met. When they get into the correct criminal justice system, they are often filtered into places that are isolating. They often lead to more acts of violence and harm directed to themselves. They also have a very high risk of victimization and early death or early sickness. There's two issues here. The first one is the ethics of this issue. Should we maintain this cycle of cycling inmates through harsh and ineffective approaches? Or is there an ethical approach where some of these inmates maybe have a more appropriate way where treatment policies and practices are evidence-based could work and we could have an impact on the cost? So the first issue is ethics, but now we've moved towards cost. The second issue is cost. Offenders with mental health issues are one of the most expensive of all groups in the criminal justice system. They take more staff to respond, whether that's a police interaction. They require more resources, whether that's training in a court setting. And when they're eventually housed in a jail or a prison, they consume a lot more resources than perhaps any other group. Their rival groups would be pregnant female inmates with OB/GYN issues, geriatric inmates who require Disability Act requirements, and death row inmates who require high levels of staffing and procedural approaches. But as a broad group, offenders with mental health issues now dominate our jails and our prisons. Now, this brings us to some stereotypes where we started with this visual at the top. The stereotypes that I've found can be really broken down by asking people 5 basic questions about criminal justice. Most people feel very confident about criminal justice because they watch TV, they have a lot of media portrayals. But if you ask them these 5 questions, you tend to get 5 very different answers, and often not close to what the correct answer is. So I'm going to ask you these 5 questions, pause and see if you can answer them. So in the year 2020, how much do you think it costs to house an inmate per year in a state prison? And by house an inmate, I mean, how much does it cost for food, medicine, staff costs, all of the costs associated per inmate per year? The correct answer is $33,000 per year. Now that doesn't reflect the diversity. There are some inmates, once again, offenders and inmates with mental health conditions, that will cost a lot more than that for staffing, for medicine, and for other services and needs. There are some that will cost less than that. But that number is also influenced by location. New York and California and Chicago and some of the big cities and states will see a much higher cost compared to some of the more rural or southern states and some other areas of the country. But as an average, $33,000 is the average per inmate per year in a state prison. Second question I ask people, in female prisons, what percentage of inmates do you think have a diagnosable mental health condition? That is a condition that a therapist could go in and diagnose of the female inmate having some mental health condition. What percentage do you think? The correct answer is 66%. So 2/3 of all female inmates in prison have a mental health condition. One can think that the other 1/3 are under some sort of mental distress. So it reinforces the fact that we now have a criminal justice system that operates as a default mental health system because the population is one that is mentally ill overall. It's a majority mentally ill population. If you're curious, males in prison, the rate of diagnosable mental health is about 1/3. This is influenced by a number of factors. Men, particularly male inmates, are much less likely to seek help, are much less likely to comply with medication and therapy. So there's some social and gender factors that are influenced. There's also the influence of gangs, which are more of a male dynamic, where gang leaders do not want their gang members going, for example, into therapy because they may talk about things to their therapist about the gang. So they're reluctant to let the young gangbangers join therapy. But the men, 1/3, the women, 2/3, we're dealing with a default mental health system here. Question 3, what percentage of federal prison inmates are incarcerated due to a violent crime? So at the federal level, how many violent inmates do you think are there? Their number one crime is a violent crime. What percentage out of 100? The correct answer is 8%. Now, this is higher in state prison, but I'm constantly surprised by the number, as well as my own research experiences, of how many inmates are in prison for drug and other non-violent crimes. I once met a male inmate in my research, and I asked him, what would you do if you ever got into a fight? He told me, I don't know how to fight. I've never been in a fight. If I ever got into a fight, I guess I would lose. Violence is actually a trained skill. You have to learn how to be violent in many ways. If you're going to be a good fighter, you have to learn the skill set. Some of these folks just never learn how to be violent. We assume because they're in prison that they're violent. That's not the case. Number 4, what percentage of prison inmates receive a visit every year? Let me explain this. Out of all prison inmates in the United States, what percentage of them receive at least one visit from anyone, family, friends, anyone per year? The correct answer is 33%. 1/3 of inmates receive a visit from anyone per year. This could be one visit from a priest, a family friend, anyone. There's a lot of difficulties here in terms of transportation and other factors for families. However, it highlights the issue that 2/3 of all prison inmates never receive a visit from the outside every year. Think about what that means on Christmas Day. Think about what that means when they see other people being visited. Think about how isolated and detached from society this group is. We have this term in criminal justice, reintegration. The idea that as inmates are released from jail or prison, we reintegrate them into society. However, I would question this word. If we have 2/3 of all inmates who don't even receive a visit from anyone, I would question whether they were integrated in society in the first place. But this has important implications for offenders with mental illness, as they're often a detached, isolated, and vulnerable population outside and inside the criminal justice system. And the final question, and in some ways one of the most important questions, is what percentage of all inmates in prison will return to society at some point? So out of everybody that gets sent to prison, we often think of prison as the place that people just go to or disappear to and become invisible. How many come back? The correct answer is 95%. In other words, 5% of inmates who go to prison will die there. 95% will return. So this suggests that prison and jails and the criminal justice system as a whole is not some place where criminals and people with mental health and offenders with mental health are just sent, and these problems that face our society just disappear. Rather, the criminal justice system is an investment. It's an investment for $33,000 a year, and 95% of them will come back. One other important consideration: they don't come back equally. Inmates disproportionately come back to communities of color and low socioeconomic communities, poor communities, Black communities, Hispanic communities. This is where the inmates disproportionately return to. This can have devastating effects on a community if they are returned damaged, angry, victimized, and with more mental health concerns, issues, and a lack of care that addresses their needs. So one thing to think about in terms of the history of criminal justice and mental health, does the criminal justice system to you represent an investment where policies and practices could make a difference for society overall? Or does it represent a place where we send people, warehouse them, and they do the crime, they do the time, and they deal with it? Your own personal philosophy will often influence the way you approach these issues in our society. However, it is interesting in that the overlap of these different factors often converge. So in 1939, Penrose wrote the following quote: "Criminality, insanity, and mental deficiency are all three relative terms, for the difference between normal and abnormal implied in each of them is a matter of degree." What this means is things like criminality, mental illness, and also mental disabilities often converge. There's a very strong overlap between crime and health. You'll find this time and time again. And that's the point of this first chapter, the intersection of criminal justice and mental health.